Welcome to Reinventing You, a podcast of the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, which is abbreviated as UERU to emphasize the UERU in our name. UERU was founded in 2000 as a Boyer-inspired national consortium and is today comprised of over 138 member institutions, all of which are dedicated, as our name states, to growth and development in undergraduate education, specifically as it is organized at research universities.
We're your hosts, Julia Michaels, UERU Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships, from whom you just heard, and yours truly, Steve Dandino, UERU Executive Director and Associate Provost at Colorado State University. The university has hosted UERU since 2013. Julia and I are just absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Robert Gibbs, Professor of Philosophy and Religion and the inaugural Director of the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto, and the author of the 2025 University of British Columbia Press volume, What Could a University Be?, subtitled Revolutionary Ideas for the Future, which will serve as our focus. Professor Gibbs earned his BA from Yale University and MA and PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto and is the author of many previous books in continental philosophy, Jewish philosophy, and the philosophy of law and ethics, such as Why Ethics, Signs of Responsibility, a Princeton University Press volume, Reasoning After Revelation, Postmodern Jewish Philosophy, co-authored with Stephen Ketnes and Peter Oakes, a Westview Press book, and Correlations in Rosenzweig and Levinas, Princeton University Press, 1992. Welcome, Bob. We're just delighted to have you.
It's great to be here.
For listeners who haven't read What a University Could Be, could you maybe provide a quick overview? What are some of its more revolutionary ideas and how have they been received thus far?
So the book proposes a vision of what a university, especially a research university, could be. A place where all the students are learning how to do research. Our universities have long focused on the research of our faculty and on training PhD students to do research, and then to replicate with those PhD students the faculty and eventually replace the faculty. But I want to argue that we should be teaching all of our students, including the professional degree students and especially the undergraduates, how to do research. So it works by exploring a bunch of ideas. There are some older ideas which are reasonably familiar but are quite relevant for the consideration of the book. Perhaps the most basic contrast of ideas is between three purposes in university education: knowledge, critique, and inquiry. Roughly, they represent the past, present, and future of thinking. Each is valuable, and they build and they overlap, but learning the logic of inquiry is the specific way we can create new knowledge, new interpretations of old texts, new inventions, new practices, new policies. And that is, of course, the task for the research university. There's some newer ideas too, and their focus on the students and on the work of research. I'll just mention one right now. The question that seems most important for me at this point is, where do the research questions come from? So I draw on many philosophers in the book, and one of the key ones is Franz Rosenzweig, who abandoned a university career in the 1920s to find an adult education center because he recognized that the key questions for thinking come from a living person, not from science. I imagine a university where the students would bring with them the vital questions of their communities, where learning how to rigorously sort and explore those questions could direct the university research agenda. This is a concept of responsibility that is responding to the questions of a society that I would call not a knowledge economy, but a society with questions. So the book proposes three revolutions. The first the one I've just referred to, is an upside-down revolution. Instead of thinking of the university's research agenda and research activities as flowing from the professors to the graduate students, maybe to the undergraduates, we should turn it around. We should work with the energy and the creativity and the curiosity of the undergraduates and let their questions flow up and form, in some ways, the very activity of research in the university. The second revolution is round and round. Round and round is the rich interdisciplinarity of research in different areas and different fields, the way that research happens in so many different places in the university and outside. But in the university, we should encourage the conversation across fields, disciplines, schools, faculties, etc., in the space of research. And finally, the third revolution is inside out. This is particularly germane to the Canadian universities, which are for the most part large public urban universities. Most of our students do not live on campus. So the students are going back and forth to their home community every day. And there's a possibility of turning the research agenda inside out, reaching out to the questions and the expertise that is in the community and drawing on that to help the university figure out what it should be exploring and making a contribution. You ask, how has this stuff been met? Well, it's in play in many places, in Canada, but also in other countries. And it's often lacking a rich intellectual justification or a sense of direction. People want to do this, but there's a need for ideas. There's a need for a kind of clarity and the possibility of something which stands above or beyond or more in these activities that will help organize them and also help justify the role of the university.
Well, I think you've already said enough, Bob, to encourage all our listeners to go out and get a copy of the book because it's a rich, rich book. And when I read it, I found it full of striking statements as well. Before we get to maybe some of the ideas that are most relevant to undergraduate education at research universities, which is what UERU is about, let's consider the big picture here for a moment. In the first paragraph of the introduction, which is entitled, "What is University Education For?" you state, and I quote, "The future is leaning hard on today. The university is a venerable institution, but if it can't help us now, then it has no future," unquote. This really caught my attention, as I think it was meant to. Could you say a little bit more maybe about this, what I would call a posited existential crisis of the university?
Well, as much as universities have a certain kind of independence or autonomy, they are public institutions, especially in Canada and in other countries, and they serve society by educating students. They aren't servile, they aren't instruments of the government or of big business, but they educate students. They are presumed to address the needs for knowledge and insight into the problems we're facing. And the surge in crises today has generated many calls on the university. Many groups and communities and areas of society are asking the university to help. There are challenges like climate change, systemic racism, new information technology, military needs, needs for peace. The list goes on and on. And it's normal for the university to try to cope with some of this. Normally, this desire for the university to actually play a role simmers at a kind of reasonable level until it starts to boil. And when we're in a situation as we are now where it is boiling, the university needs to offer something that is not merely knowledge about the past or even of the present. What it needs to do is it needs to offer a way to create knowledge for the future. And our students are the ones who we should be educating to do that. It's their promise that is the focus of the book and my sense of the way the university will have to respond. And I mean, I've been working on this book for a long time, and things have been bad enough, but it doesn't take a very clever person to see how in the last 5 years, and not only in the United States, the pressures on the universities have grown exponentially, and the need for creative and insightful and rigorous science and inquiry is greater now than we've seen in a long time.
I really love how you've put the focus on the students, and they're the ones that should be going out and solving these problems in the world. And the purpose of the research university is to educate them to do that. And a lot has been made, in the student success community over the past decade or so about becoming more student-centered. I really think that's one of the themes in this book is that students are key to understanding the university's purpose and goals. So what do you think has to change at research university to really put students at the center in a real way? Are there long-standing structures or practices that you think would need to be abandoned or radically altered in order to do this right?
Well, of course, that's the hard part. The ideas are lovely, of course, but so the first revolution is the upside down. It is changing the way we think about where the inquiry will come from, where the questions will come from. And we saw this at the Jackman Humanities Institute. We had undergraduates in our research community, and they had the best questions because they were very smart, but they hadn't been disciplined to ignore each other, to ignore other disciplines. And so the insight grew from there that really there was a flow of inquiry that could come from the bottom up. Now, the first thing I would say, and it's a very simple thing, is we have to change the metrics. Normally, when we talk about great research universities, we talk about the amount of income, of funding for research that comes into the university to fund primarily the faculty, sometimes research fellows as well. But I think the first and most basic metric is how many undergraduates are we graduating? Actually, how many students in total, but undergraduates especially, who are qualified and are thinking in a way where they can go and do research in society. So it's not just that we cherry pick one or two, the really smart ones who we'll hope will go on to become PhDs and hopefully become research professors. We're trying to educate this wide swath. And so we have to start saying that's where we are achieving our greatest good. So changing the metrics obviously has funding implications and funding consequences. The first step, I think, beyond the assessment step, is to create curricular streams for our undergraduates that focus on research from the beginning of the first year. This obviously is very consonant with a lot of what UERU does and other undergraduate programs. It's a program in some ways that happens at the University of Toronto. But if you think of it as a stream, then the point is that you take the students from the very beginning and you help cultivate their understanding of what research is, of how to do it, what counts as a good question, what counts as good data, what counts as, et cetera, et cetera. And you build on that over the 4 years or 5 years that they're there. The other main, so this obviously is very different than you starting with classes of 1,000 and waiting to get to research when you finally get into that last year of your undergraduate career. It is, in that very sense, upside down. The other is we really have to think about the PhDs and their TA work in a very different way. So in many places, including in the universities I've taught in, a lot of the TA work is merely marking or grading undergraduates' work. But we can conceive of the PhD students as people who are guiding the undergraduates to learn the logic of inquiry. So they also are in the process. They are in this project. It's complicated, obviously, but so I'm obviously proposing changing what the TAs are doing, and I'm also proposing major curricular change, which is not an easy thing to achieve. But I'll stop for there for now.
But arguably needed. But arguably needed. So I was intrigued, but given your disciplinary interests, not truly surprised by your attention to, as you say in the book, going slowly, or to elaborate a little bit, you also say fostering habits of reflection, exploration, and discernment that lead to, among other things, more valuable comments. This, you say, is the task of the university. Could you say some more about the this notion of going slowly, and how it maybe connects to what we learn from study of the humanities?
Well, in the book, I offer a significant contrast between two kinds of pages and two kinds of ways of reading. So, for a very, very long time, most of humanities scholarship was, in fact, reading and writing commentaries. And the pages of the commentary would have many text blocks on the same page. And to read it, you would go back and forth between different commentators and the central text, and you would read, as it were, very slowly if the goal was to get through that text. I mean, you would be reading with a certain speed, but it would not be a linear progression. Along came not just the printing press, but the modern editors, and they created a book that you could read straight through. It's the book we all know right now, and it was called the Humanist page. And that gives a certain velocity to reading, and you read one text straight through. We now refer to that in scholarly world as the long form argument. But the commentary page is coming back without being on paper. And it's an interesting problem that bothers the humanities professors, in fact, which is that most of our students spend most of their time reading in a page that is on a screen with a whole bunch of different text blocks. And they do not read things straight through. They're reading different things at the same time. They're commenting on things. That's called blogging. They're upvoting. They're citing. They are, in the social media world, reading in a way that is much more like the pre-modern commentary page. So my sense is that we can work with that. We don't have to just lament that people don't want to write 40-page essays. We can think with them in a way that captures what happens when you read multiple things together and balance them with each other. And that is how we read and write. But of course, if we're talking about the future, we're talking about the students, they all the more so. So there's a possibility of resuscitating some of the very skills and traditions that that governed the tradition of humanistic scholarship in the new information technology environment. And it isn't that reading a bunch of things at the same time just means you're totally distracted. It means that you move in different lateral ways. You look something up, you find out that, oh, I'd better look at that article. You follow through different kinds of questions at the same time. And that kind of conversation amongst the text or amongst the windows on your screen, that is actually something which the university can train people to do better and to help them understand how that composite mode of reading and writing actually is appropriate to solving some of our problems in the world.
So you mentioned social media just now, but there's an even bigger transformation happening. As we all know, many of our UERU members are wrestling with artificial intelligence in education and how it might threaten the very purpose of the university. Now, you write on page 77, if the university exists only to warehouse knowledge, then it is doomed. the focus must now shift to our second idea, critique. The university needs to replace the question of access to information with an emphasis on judgment and interpretation. So my question is, in a world where there is so much misinformation happening, so much discord, what role do you see for the university in pursuing truth and in verifying and demonstrating the claims of science?
Well, this is a very hard problem, and I don't have a quick answer. And it's good because if I had a good answer today, in 6 months, AI would have learned more and it might not work the same way. For me, the the ideas at stake here is a contrast between an idea of the university as the place for the unity of all knowledge and an idea of the university as a place that actually inhabits and is careful and rigorous with discord. By which I mean different disciplines, different faculties have different ideas of what constitutes a good argument, or in fact, a good experiment, or a good claim for truth. It's not all the same epistemology across the university. And because research seeks to find the truth in the discipline that it is in, there's an intrinsic disagreement between the faculties, what Kant called a conflict of the faculties, that is constitutive of the university. The university actually inhabits that and it grows from that and it strengthens that. But the student, and this of course is the point, the student can learn from that how to recognize that in different spheres, different kinds of claims, different kinds of evidence count for more and less, and can become familiar with the different spaces and different modes of arguing and of validating, of testing, of conjuring up the hypothesis. So we want our students to be exposed to that discord in this more disciplined, rigorous, and pacific context, precisely because that will help them cope with the struggles that are going on with all of the misinformation and all of the opposition to, thinking about X or Y. It's a little more complicated when we then add the question of what will the machines be doing. And I don't have a full answer on that, I must say. But I do think that the training in the different modes, the sense that research is not the same in chemistry as it is in sociology and nursing as it is in philosophy, that if we can help the students understand the complexity and the variability of what counts as research, what counts as knowledge, what counts as good inquiry, they will be able to more easily sort through whatever the chat bot is throwing their way to see and evaluate it, whether it fits the canons of good thinking and knowledge.
So it's really about being in the context of the university, and the way that students learn how to do research helps them in the broader world with distinguishing fact from fiction. You also ask, is every question worthy of being asked? Students have a lot of questions, and you argue that student questions are inherently worth pursuing. I can see how faculty might resist this idea for fear of compromising disciplinary rigor or research standards. So how do you respond to that critique? And practically speaking, how do you help students learn to ask better questions without simply imposing faculty priorities?
So first, you do have to realize this is a very radical or revolutionary claim. The idea that the questions for research might actually come from the students seems preposterous in general in the everyday work of the university. And the philosopher I'm quoting in relationship to this, Franz Rosenzweig, he declined a university position in Germany in the 1920s because he felt the university would never be able to actually listen to the questions that matter to people. It would be so stuck with thinking that the science, the scholars, understood what counted and that the sciences themselves would determine the questions. And so he quit the university. So in some sense, my proposal here is an attempt to imagine a university that he wouldn't have had to quit. So what makes a question really worthwhile is that it makes a difference for someone's life. It makes a difference to their sense of meaning. And the presumption that I would have is that the students, yeah, they've got all kinds of questions, but some of their most important questions are questions which register things that are happening in their community that people are very concerned about. So you can have people who are worried about local events and local politics. People are worried about local hunger or poverty. But you can also have people who are worried about what's happening at the Great Barrier Reef, or they're worried about climate change, or they're concerned about how the new banking regime will work with AI. So it's not that every question per se is important. It's that any question could be if it is coming from someone who actually, for whom it really matters. Then comes the hard part, finding out why it matters, what is researchable in relationship to it. After all, if somebody says, well, I just want you to look up some stuff for us, the university, that's not what research does. It used to be that just looking up stuff was good enough, but we know how to do that now. We can do that on our phones. The problem isn't just looking up stuff. It's figuring out where the deeper problem, the problem that's worthy of thinking and exploring, and that is the cultivation of the question. So this sorting of questions and this cultivation of questions, this is really what the education is for. We should start with undergraduates who won't know what makes the best kind of research question, who won't necessarily know how to go about it. But we should pay attention to the concerns that they're expressing, the questions that are coming from their community, from society, because as I say, we have a society full of questions. There's so much in doubt, in concern, in question right now. And Rosenzweig also says that letting the person determine the question, letting that personal question actually matter, is not the same as taking an answer from anyone. The question opens up thought. If they say, we want you to do research on this because we want to find out that it does, this chemical does X, or this social program does Y, that's not research. The question, we're interested in cultivating the questions, not in having the university provide the answer that somebody's looking for. That is the answer that they're requesting. We have to go looking. It is the looking. So this training to pay attention to the question, to find the kernel of the question, and to figure out through a series of years of education, 4 years, 5 years, whatever of education, is to learn better and better ways of sorting the right kind of question and sorting how we would do research to address it. And that, as I say, is my sense of what the undergraduate education, but also the higher levels of education should be too.
We were chatting earlier, and you mentioned, Bob, that you have a book launch coming with two university presidents, former president of the University of Toronto, one of them, and another. And that sounded exciting to me and very appropriate because, an institution like your own, so large, 100,000 students, as you say, serving a very, very large metropolitan community as well as the nation and world, has a hard time. It's hard to imagine such organizations changing, particularly one with a famously decentralized structure as the University of Toronto has. And yet, here you are proposing revolutionary ideas for the future, your subtitle, and there's a great pressing need for them, which is also a case made in the book. So how are we, us folks who are part and parcel of these institutions that are often vast and complex, decentralized, not all for the bad, as you point out, in some ways very important that they are that way. How should we think about the practical issues of social change. What can we prioritize? What needs doing sooner than later? What kind of pace? Not that this should fall on your shoulders necessarily to answer, but what do you see as, and you've spoken to it to some, I should say, but what manner of change is needed to forestall these truly crisis situation that we find ourselves in?
So, um, because I didn't try to create a blueprint or a series of programs. Instead, I wanted to give some ideas that were meant to help, and they have to help if they help at all locally. So, to make the case for intensifying research education and reaching all the students at a research university, this case has to be made in each context, in each place. In the big publics, in the extremely well endowed privates, it's going to be different in different places. In the Canadian system, or in Australia or New Zealand or Germany, it will look quite different than it might look in England or the US. So the period of change, they used to say at the university, was 35 years. That's how long it took a faculty member to come in and to go out. I'm wondering whether we can imagine that period of change being 5 years, the length of a student's career. That is, if instead of assuming that the thing that has to change primarily is the core of the faculty, we started thinking about, well, what about the speed in which undergraduates move through? So we need to make some of these changes. We're going to need to model these new curricula I referred to. And it turns out that teaching stream faculty are often there already at this point. The teaching stream faculty are not people who don't know how to do research. They're people who love to teach. And some of them are, in fact, really leading the charge on teaching undergraduates how to do research. So one of the moves that people are trying in some places is to let these teaching stream faculty become embedded in the context of the research stream faculty, and to instigate these new models to sort of step by step bring along the transformation of the vision of the research faculty also. That's not as fast as we might need, but it is a way of doing it. And of course, it assumes that people are there because they want to be in the university and they want to do this work. Obviously, we need to reward faculty for participating in this, but the reward is probably not giving them a prize if they have one or two brilliant students, which is how most of these prizes have been going, at least in the universities I know. But imagine giving prizes for people who generate a cohort of students who are learning how to do research. And of course, that also means that you have to, you don't only have to prepare them for this, but in terms of the alumni capacity, you need to follow where students go. Obviously, the vast preponderance of our students are not going to be found as professors at universities. They go everywhere. And if we start seeing not just the anecdotal success stories, so-and-so studied with this person and is now doing that, so-and-so is doing, but we start seeing a kind of measurable, again, metric of success, then I think more people will come along. So I think in each university and certainly in each university system, this is going to look different. And in some university systems, there's a great deal of segmentation or stratification or whatever you want to call it, so that there are research universities that focus on research, and then there are They're sort of the normal level of university, and then there are community colleges or there are liberal arts colleges. Like the map of the US is complicated, but you should try the map of the French higher education if you want to see things that are complicated. Part of the argument of the book is that not every university has to be a research intensive university. Not everyone has to have these goals. But the ones that do have this goal have to have the confidence that they're admitting students who are capable and eager to learn how to do research. And what we find is they actually are. It's I think always a surprise to some of the faculty to find out the students really do want to learn how to do research. So it's the desire on the student side is there. The structural problems tend to be based on that 35-year cycle of change that keeps things stable. Now, of course, stability isn't a bad thing in a university. I'm not totally interested in blowing it up, but I am, in fact, proposing 3 revolutionary changes.
Is there anything else you'd like to share that we haven't talked about, Bob?
Well, I think what's impressive about what you all are doing is that a lot of what happened over the last 15 or 20 years is the discussion of student-centered has focused very much on student services and not so much on student education. And I think it's great that there are services that attend to physical health and physical well-being and exercise, mental health, better food. And it's not so much the case in Canada, but we still do have more dormitory spaces than we used to. These issues are not bad things for the university to be concerned about, but I do feel often that the focus on the student's education has slipped out of the center of the effort. And when the vast preponderance of the people in the university are your students, especially the undergraduate students who are the vast preponderance, 60,000 of the 100,000 students, there's a lot that that needs to be turned, as it were. Our vision or our focus, I think, really needs to come back to what it is we're claiming to do as a university, which is not to provide really great student services, but to provide really great education. And in the very beginning of the book, I talk about the idea of study. And it's really interesting because I've read a lot of the books that have come out about universities in a while. You probably have too. It's interesting how, students sometimes come in and often student services come in, but studying itself seems to be almost neglected topic. And I think that in some ways, the idea of study, and particularly the idea of study in relationship to the logic of inquiry and research, is such a great potential light for us when we're trying to think about what the university could be. So I think that's probably the point I would be most happy to underscore again.
Sounds like a good place to end. Thank you, Bob. We so appreciate you talking with us about your book, which again is published by the University of British Columbia Press and available in the US via the University of Chicago Press. URU members can log in to My URU to hear 2 additional questions and some concluding discussion for UVPs and their colleagues. For now, though, thanks to listeners of Reinventing You, a podcast of the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, or URU. Reinventing You is available wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about URU, check us out at ueru.org.
Well, Bob, some defend the humanities by noting their value for career preparedness or readiness, as some say. And I don't think any of us, you included, are opposed to students finding jobs. But your defense in this book is based, it seems to me on my reading, more on the intrinsic value of the humanities. Would you care to say just a bit more about that, though I recognize it's a very complicated topic?
Well, I think I would start with a very obvious point, which is that the careers of the future will be different. Um, Sometimes people say, oh, that's why we need something called lifelong learning. And I certainly think lifelong learning would be a good idea. But in the book, I want to argue that we need to have lifelong creation of knowledge. That is, we're not trying to teach the students in a way that will allow them to learn what other people discover. We're trying to make them the people who will discover. And so people will need, as I said, in relationship to the question about humanities and slow reading, which isn't necessarily slow, but just different, they're going to need to be able to read and to write and to engage with the past in different ways. And in that way, create new future possibilities. So the constitution of meaning depends on language, culture, religion, philosophy. And to have deep insight there will offer the abilities to think in new ways, and this will be in demand. The value isn't that we will have gotten them ready for the first job, it's that we will have gotten them ready to create the new jobs. Because when the challenge is to how to make sense of our world as it is profoundly wrenched out of its familiar patterns, the humanities are actually remarkably rich and valuable as a resource for teaching people how to think through that and how to work both with the past and with the challenges that are facing us as we think about the future. So it's not that we want people to just go sit in a room by themselves and be content to be knowing something so interesting. On the contrary, we think that the challenge of the future requires people to have these skills, have these ways of thinking and engaging with crisis, with problems, with unintelligibility, with the real deep questions about meaning in order to help all of us through the muddle that we're in.
Well, speaking of muddle, I think we can all agree that recent tensions between the US and Canada have strained what was once a reliably collaborative relationship. From your vantage point at Toronto, what concrete effects are you seeing on cross-border academic collaboration? And more broadly, do the challenges of the moment change how you think about the university's role as a space that transcends national politics?
Well, um, I'm not going to really answer the first question directly because there have been so many effects and they're bad. And it's a really difficult time for many of my colleagues who have built their career on working closely with people across the border. It's just really tough. But I can offer some insight into how this might be and also in how we might want to think about it. So, the funding of research is always dependent on what sectors in society seem to pressing and urgent. It's not that the money just comes from beneficent donors or governments. There's always a reason for it. And the university is never purely free or autonomous. It just, it is embedded in the society. And in many fields, the topics are less political. And often they're less local. So at the Jackman Humanities Institute, for instance, we work to create research dialogues across national boundaries, national borders. and also across institutional varieties, because we felt the way that other people in other countries conducted research would teach us more about our own priorities at a university like the University of Toronto in the Canadian context. So we felt that we didn't need to know what a university that was just like us was doing. Now, there are a lot of researchers at the University of Toronto who want to work with researchers who look just like them at other places, at universities that look just like the University of Toronto at other places. But we actually were hoping to create a real dialogue about how research in the university fit in the society it was in. And so there is this interesting tension, from my perspective, between that sort of dialogue and the agenda, which by definition is going to be more restrictive and nationally focused, of any university. And it seems to me that the hope is that the universities will be able to continue to pursue the dialogue, but mindful of these limitations and differences of the agenda in different places. Now, the United States is, or England, or Hungary, or etc. There are many countries now that are experiencing grave pressure on the research agenda of the university. That problem I don't have great insight for. But in terms of what it means for the Canadian universities that are actually continuing to enjoy great support from the government and in society for the research they do, this is actually an important challenge to figure out how does research respond to that, and how can we have a real dialogue when other systems are not opening in the same way to the dialogue that they were even a year ago.
This has been a wonderful and fascinating conversation. Any last thoughts, Bob? Steve, any other questions from you?
No, just I agree. Just really greatly appreciate this opportunity to speak with you, Bob, and to hear more about the book. We'll give you the last word.
Well, that's very kind. Uh, I mentioned to the two of you that when I got a message from you, I already knew about you, and I was so delighted because if there's it it's not like there's some person who is teaching some lab course at some university and has figured out the undergraduates really are capable of learning how to do research. There is this whole network that is engaged, committed, is in conversation with each other, has been around for a while, was supported not by the universities in the first instance, but has found its way to gain the support of its universities. This is an incredible group that I'm speaking to now through you. It's part of the inspiration for some of the things I've been thinking about, and it obviously fits so tightly in the vision that I have proposed in the book. And so I'm really I'm honored to be able to speak with you, but I also I can't say enough how much encouragement I take from the effort of your association and the universities engaged in it. So thank you.